Hello everybody, thank you for tuning in. My name is Karl Orvik. Several years ago I wrote a scale book called New Scale Method. It's for both violin and viola. I would say the majority of the people using the book currently are my students, and which is great because if there are any questions about the book, the students can go right to the source and can ask me and I can immediately answer them. Over the years, there's also been interest from friends and colleagues, fellow teachers, and some of those people live in different parts of the country or are not in my immediate area, and so addressing any concerns or questions that they have is a little more difficult. I'm making this video both as a supplemental resource for my students and also hopefully as a detailed introduction to the book for anyone else who is interested in the different things that the book offers. So I hope you enjoy this video. If you have any comments or questions and you don't have my contact information, you can also just leave comments below in the YouTube comment section. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoy. Okay, so here is the book. As I mentioned, it is for violin and viola. You can probably tell that that is actually a violin on both covers. I was kind of going for a consistent image, and I really like that picture. Fun fact, that picture actually is a picture of my own violin. My sister Carrie took that picture. She's a photographer in San Francisco. Now, going straight to the book, to the content of the book. The book is divided into two parts: the scale and arpeggio exercises, and then the rhythm and bowing exercises. Starting with the scale and arpeggios, they are organized by the 12 tonal areas, and each tonal area has 8 pages of exercises, which are the same exercises from one tonal area to the next. And also both the violin and the viola books have exactly the same exercises. In this video, I'll be using the violin book as the example, and my demonstrations, which will be coming up, will also be on the violin, but just know that these exercises are all the same in the viola version as well. So let's go straight to, we're going to use the tonal area of C as the example, and we'll start. You can see it has the major scale, the natural minor, the harmonic minor, the melodic minor, and then I've added the octatonic and the chromatic scales on that first page. You'll notice too, under each scale it says RBT and then a number. I will definitely be explaining that later, but the RBT stands for rhythm and bowing table. So there are tables that we'll be talking about in a different section. Then moving on to page 2 of the single note scales, we've got all the modal scales with the exception of the Aeolian and the Ionian, which are obviously represented by the natural minor and the major anyways. But we have Locrian, Phrygian, Dorian, Mixolydian, and Lydian. And then after that, the heptatonic version of the blues scale, the whole tone scale, and the pentatonic scale. Moving to the next 2 pages are the arpeggios, single note arpeggios. And I used the same sort of traditional harmonic progression or sequence that is found in a lot of books, like the Karl Flesch book, the Barbara Barber book, where there's the minor and the major and the submediant minor and the subdominant major and the subdominant minor. I just added the diminished and the augmented as well. So you have, it starts with the diminished
and then ends with the augmented. So that also makes a nice little harmonic progression as well. Then on the next page is the seventh chord arpeggios, single note, and I've also added a few here than what are normally found in scale books. The augmented major seventh, then the major seventh, the dominant seventh, the minor major seventh, and the minor minor seventh, the half diminished seventh, and the diminished seventh. Moving on to the next page, the next 4 pages then are all the double stop scales and arpeggios. So it starts with the thirds in major, and then the fourths in major, which I find extremely valuable. The fifths, we play a lot of fifths in the music that we play, so might as well get some practice on those. Sixth, and then the sevenths, of course, are very difficult, but I find them very useful for intonation, and especially sort of being able to hear the line, the diatonic scale, as you're playing the seventh above it. It's a good ear training exercise. Octaves and fingered octaves are the same, you just use different fingering, obviously, and then the tenths in major. The next page is the exact same thing, except everything's in harmonic minor. So you have the thirds, the fourths, the fifths, the sixths, the sevenths, the octaves, and the tenths. And then finally, which I definitely consider one of the harder parts of these exercises, are the double stop arpeggios. So again, it's the same double stops, but now they're in arpeggios. So thirds, the major thirds, or the thirds in major, the fourths in major, the fifths, the sixth, the sevenths again, octaves and fingered octaves, and tenths. And then the same thing in the harmonic minor, thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, sevenths, octaves, fingered octaves, and tenths. So that concludes the content, going over the content of the scales and arpeggios, and now we can move on to the rhythm and bowings.
Okay, so now we are looking at the rhythm and bowing tables, which are located at the beginning of the book. There are 7 different tables, and as I said, each scale and exercise in the content of the book corresponds to one of these rhythm and bowing tables. An important part of the design of these rhythm and bowing tables was for me to kind of distill what could be, what is hundreds and even more hundreds of possible rhythm and bowing patterns. I don't know if you're familiar with the Galamian scale book, which I think is genius, or other books that just have pages and pages of different rhythm and bowing patterns. They're all great, but in a way very unwieldy and difficult on certain practical levels. So what I decided was I would try to focus on specifically the relationship of notes per bow versus notes per beat. And while that relationship is specific and exact, it's notation neutral, if you will. So if you 2 notes per beat, it could be 2 quarter notes where the beat is a half note, or 2 eighth notes where the beat is a quarter note, etc. It's not written in any specific notation. So that hopefully helps to distill and condense things and makes it a lot less voluminous. So I'm going to start with RBT2, just because that corresponds to the most number of exercises in the book. But I'll quickly go through the other rhythm and bowing tables as well, just to sort of give a little example and demonstration of how they work. And then at the end, I'll explain the substitutions. Okay, here we are, rhythm and bowing table number 2. And the way this works is that any note that is underlined means it's that many notes per beat. So if there's 2 notes that are underlined, it would be 2 notes per beat. And by note, I mean note head is the way it's notated there. So if you look at group A, number 1, that's just 1 note per beat. Group A is a great exercise because, as you can see, number 7 is 12 notes per bow, but still just 1 note per beat. So I usually set the metronome pretty slow because we have to get faster towards the end. So I'll put it at 40 right now. And group A number 1 would just be okay. Of course, group A number 7 would be very slow. If you're a fan of those long minute bows, that is a very good exercise. Group B number 2 would be 2 notes per bow, 2 notes per beat, but also 2 notes per bow. So group C, let's look at number 4. That would be 3 notes per beat and 4 notes per bow. So etc. Remember that this not just applies to major scales, but also minor, octatonic, chromatic, and the 4-note arpeggios. So like I said, RBT2 sort of applies to the most number of the scale and arpeggio exercises. If you look at group D, which is 4 notes per beat and 3 notes per bow, you could do that with one of the arpeggios. This would be the augmented arpeggio. Moving on, RBT3 is all the modal scales plus the blues scale. You could start with the blues, and group B number 3 would be 2 notes per bow, 2 notes per beat, 3 notes per bow. Etc. Could pick one of the modal scales, pick out the Mixolydian. So let's do group E number 2, which is 7 notes per beat, but 2 notes per bow. Okay. Slightly out of tune, but that's okay. You get the idea. If we do RBT number 4, that is the pentatonic and double stop scales. Start with the pentatonic. How about group D number 2, which would be 5 notes per beat and 2 notes per bow. So you could also try the double stop scales. Let's try number 4, group C number 4. In this case it's 5 notes per bow, but 3 notes per beat. Moving on, RBT 5 is only applicable to whole tone scales, but also the same type of exercises. So group D number 3, which is 6 per beat but only 4 per bow. So it'd be RBT 6, just the standard 3-note arpeggios, and all the patterns that apply to that. Let's look at group C number 4, which is 6 per bow, 3 per beat. And then finally, group RBT 7, which is the double stop arpeggios, which are, in my view, the hardest exercises in the book. So I'm not going to go very fast. If you look at group E and group F, 6 per beat, 12 per beat, those are quite fast. Not impossibly fast, but maybe for yours truly not going to happen today. But I'll just stick to something a little slower. I love, even though they're hard to play, I'm going to try the double stops and fourths, which I think are just really great for intonation. So I'll do group B number 2, 2 notes per bow, 2 notes per beat. Like I said, very good for intonation. Okay, so here we are at the substitutions. If you've noticed at the top of each RBT, you can see the list of the substitutions, such as rhythm and staccato, and so I just wanted to show you how those apply to the different patterns in the RBTs. So we're going to look at just in depth. We're going to look at RBT2, group D number 3, which you should see below on the screen. And just remember that, so the substitutions are basically variations on this particular pattern. On this pattern is the model, and then you can apply these substitutions. But in the interest of keeping things consolidated and streamlined, instead of writing out all the different variations that you can do on this pattern, and then lots of pages and making it, as I said, kind of unwieldy, the variations in this case are sort of outsourced to the person playing it. So that could be delegated by a teacher. A teacher could say, oh, well, let's do these substitutions. Or if you're in a college or whatever technique class, it could be a fun activity to do in groups. Or you could just, if you're on your own practicing, you could just come up with your own variations on these, on this model. So I'm going to just demonstrate a sample of how you could do it with each different substitution. So we'll start with the rhythm substitution, and when we get to RBT number 1, I'll explain this a little bit more, but basically the way that I made the rhythm thing happen is simply by giving one of the note heads not filled in, and that would just indicate that the note is longer than the notes that are filled in. You can determine what that length is, as long as everything still fits into the beat. So if you look at the rhythm substitution that I came up with for this example, the first note would be longer than the next 3, as opposed to all 4 of them being equal. The bowing stays the same. So it would sound like this as an example. Now I could also make it, if you see the second example of the rhythm substitution, I could do, instead of just the first note being longer, I could make the first and the third notes in the pattern longer. So and you know, the variations could be quite much. There could be not infinite variations, but there's a lot of ways you could vary that depending on which notes you change to make longer or shorter. The staccato substitution would be, I just decided to make, again, keeping the bowing the same, but putting a staccato on the first note of each bowing pattern. So that would sound... The accent substitution, in this example, I decided to put the accent on the last note of each slur, so the last note of the slur in each pattern. So that would sound... the slur, changing the slurs, so I could, instead of having 3 notes in a slur, I could decide to do 2 notes and 1 separate. So that would look like this. The bowing substitution would just mean, this one's not so bad, but this would mean that you would just, if you started on a down bow, you'd start it on an up bow this time. So I'll do that same variation, but now starting on an up bow. The fingering substitution would mean that you just randomly, your teacher might do this, or again, if you're in a class, this might be a fun activity, just to make up the world's worst fingering and try to still play the scale. So I'll try that now. I'm gonna do a fingering I would normally not do. And then finally, you have the option of changing the tempo. And so here we're at 40, but we could do the same pattern if I just flip it up to 84. So it'd be the same thing, but much faster. And harder, obviously. Okay. So those are the substitutions. Okay, finally is the last rhythm and bowing table, which is RBT1. In this one, I actually decided to write out all the different rhythm pattern variations that you can have, but only up till 3 notes per beat and 3 notes per bow. So it's a smaller sort of sample size. You can see all the different variations on the rhythm and bowing patterns that you can have, and it happens to also work out for every single scale and arpeggio in the book. So if you remember, when we did the scales and arpeggios themselves, every RBT was RBT1 and then something else, RBT1 and then whatever other RBT. RBT1 applies to every of them. So you can do this one with any of the exercises. And like I said, I've written out the different, longer notes versus shorter notes. However, so for example, let's look at group A, number 10. For example, that's all within one beat. You have 2 longer notes and 1 shorter note. So that could sound like this. Whoop. Get that back down to 40. That could sound etc. Or if you were so inclined, or again, someone in the group you're playing with says, I want it a different way, or your teacher says this, you could make the rhythm something like this. So that the first 2 notes are still longer in value than the last note. So it doesn't matter. The 2 longer notes don't have to be of equal value. They can be different values, but as long as they're both longer than the short note, which is the colored in note head. Looking at group B, number 14, it's the same essential rhythm, but then with a different bowing pattern. So this would be 2 notes per bow, starting with the first 2 notes slurred. So we can also apply the substitutions to these patterns just like we did in the further example. So if we look at, for example, group C, number 18, that is 3 notes per bow. So again, it's that same pattern of two longer notes and 1 shorter note per beat. But I'll put a staccato on the last note. So etc. If we look at group C, number 25, I could do the slur variation here, where I will take out the first slur and make those ones separate. So, but then I'll keep the second slur. So that would sound like this. Etc. So that concludes the demonstration. Thank you all for watching this video. I hope it's been helpful in explaining some of the more complicated aspects of the book, especially the rhythm and bowing tables. If you have any questions or comments or any thoughts about this, I welcome all feedback. You can just put them in the comment box below. And if you are interested in purchasing a copy of the violin or the viola versions of this book, there's also a link to both books below. So thank you again for watching.